When an elderly woman entered the upscale restaurant, no one could have predicted that her quiet presence would expose a deep truth and halt the evening's smooth flow. The soft glow of the setting sun filtered through the large windows of Pemberton's bistro, casting long shadows on the polished floors. Inside, the air was thick with the sound of clinking glasses, hushed conversations, and a live pianist playing soothing melodies. This was the kind of place where celebrations took place. Anniversaries, promotions, business deals. Luxury was the currency. As the front door swung open, an elderly black woman stepped inside, her movements slow but dignified. Despite the years that had etched themselves into her skin, she stood tall and poised, wearing a navy coat with intricate stitching along the cuffs. Her small handbag rested securely under her arm, and her presence, though quiet, seemed to carry an unspoken weight, drawing a few curious glances. The hostess greeted her with a polite but somewhat forced smile. "Do you have a reservation, ma'am?" she asked, her eyes darting nervously toward the line of guests waiting to be seated. "Yes, under the name Mrs. Holloway," the woman responded, her voice calm and steady. The hostess glanced at the reservation list, nodded curtly, and led her to a table tucked away in a shadowed corner near the kitchen. It was a less than ideal location, but Mrs. Holloway didn't mind. She settled in, folding her hands on the table, quietly surveying the room. The menu in front of her remained unopened. Minutes passed, then more minutes. The waiter, a young man in his late 20s named Todd, walked past her table several times without acknowledging her. He stopped only to serve other tables, his smile for them wide and genuine, while his eyes seemed to deliberately avoid hers. Finally, he approached, his voice clipped. "Sorry for the delay. We're really busy tonight. I'll be back to take your order soon." Mrs. Holloway gave a polite nod. "Take your time," she said quietly, her composure unwavering, but the tension in the air was palpable. The few nearby diners exchanged nervous glances, clearly noticing the disparity in the service. The young couple at the next table whispered amongst themselves, casting furtive looks at the elderly woman, wondering why she hadn't been served. Todd's behavior didn't change. He continued to serve the other tables with enthusiasm, cracking jokes, while Mrs. Holloway remained patient, her calm demeanor in stark contrast to the growing unease around her. Despite the longer waits, she hadn't uttered a word of complaint. Then, another diner, a man in his early 40s, who had been quietly observing from a table near the bar, narrowed his eyes. He was sharp, his senses finely tuned to the subtleties of human interaction. He could see the way Todd seemed to deliberately avoid Mrs. Holloway, treating her with impatience, while lavishly serving others. What no one in the room realized was that this man wasn't just any patron. He was the owner of Pemberton's Bistro, and Mrs. Holloway wasn't just any guest. She was his mother. Elijah Holloway had seen his mother endure similar treatment throughout her life, but this was the first time he had witnessed it in his own restaurant. His jaw clenched as he observed Todd's behavior, each minute drawing a tighter knot of frustration in his chest. Elijah wanted to confront the young waiter immediately, to demand an apology right then and there, but something inside him told him to wait. He needed to let Todd show his true colors. As the minutes dragged on, Todd walked past Mrs. Holloway again, his face betraying nothing but annoyance. "Still haven't decided?" he asked, his tone mocking. Mrs. Holloway looked up at him, her eyes steady. "I'm ready to order," she said, her voice calm, but there was a quiet intensity behind her words. Todd nodded curtly and walked away, but it was then that Elijah stood, his movements slow and deliberate. Every eye in the room followed him as he made his way to Todd, the air thick with anticipation. The pianist stopped playing, the soft notes fading into a haunting silence. Elijah reached Todd just as the waiter laughed with another table, unaware of what was about to unfold. His smile faltered when he saw Elijah standing beside him. "I didn't know you were here," Todd stammered, trying to force a smile. "I've been here," Elijah replied coldly, "and I've been watching." Todd's confusion was palpable, but it didn't last long. Elijah's gaze flicked toward his mother, who was still sitting quietly in her corner, her eyes now locked on the two men, then back at Todd. "You've been ignoring my mother for over 30 minutes. Not even a glass of water. Do you think she deserves less than anyone else in this restaurant?" Todd's face drained of color, his eyes darting between Elijah and Mrs. Holloway. He stammered but couldn't find the words. "She's my mother," Elijah continued, his voice like ice, "and you've treated her like an inconvenience, a person you'd rather not deal with. That's unacceptable." The room was completely silent now. The pianist was frozen, his hands hovering over the keys. Every diner in the room had turned their attention to the confrontation. Elijah turned to the manager, Dana, who had been standing by the bar, uncertain about whether to intervene. "Dana," he said firmly, "take over table 12. Make sure my mother gets everything she needs." Immediately, she nodded quickly, hurrying to Mrs. Holloway's side, apologizing profusely and filling her water glass. Meanwhile, Todd stood frozen, his face a mixture of shame and humiliation. He muttered something under his breath, but Elijah cut him off. "Save it. You're done here for today. Go home." Todd stood there for a moment, torn between defiance and regret. Then, without a word, he removed his apron and left the restaurant. The heavy door swung shut behind him, and a thick silence lingered in the room. Elijah approached his mother's table. "You okay, Mom?" he asked softly. Mrs. Holloway smiled, reaching out to pat his hand. "I'm fine, son. You handled that well." Elijah exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing. "I should have stepped in sooner." She shook her head gently. "No, you let him reveal his true character. Sometimes that's more powerful than confronting someone right away." As the evening returned to its usual rhythm, the atmosphere in Pemberton's bistro had shifted. Conversations resumed, but they were now more thoughtful, laced with the quiet respect that the staff had witnessed that night. Dana personally ensured Mrs. Holloway's meal was served promptly, apologizing with sincerity. In the background, a young couple who had witnessed the entire incident exchanged their thoughts. "It's insane," the woman said quietly. "How often does this happen, and we just don't see it?" Her partner nodded. "It's not just about what you see. It's about whether you're willing to stand up when it happens." Elijah overheard their conversation as he passed their table. He thought about the countless times Todd had gotten away with such behavior simply because no one spoke up. As the evening ended and Mrs. Holloway prepared to leave, she placed a hand on Elijah's arm. "You did good, son," she said, her voice full of warmth. Elijah smiled faintly. "I still wish it hadn't happened." She squeezed his arm. "What matters is how you responded. You gave everyone in there something to think about. That's the real change." As the two left the restaurant, the staff gathered for a meeting. Dana addressed them quietly but firmly. "Tonight was a wake-up call, not just about how we treat our guests, but about the culture we're creating here. Everyone who walks through those doors deserves respect. No exceptions." Elijah sat quietly, taking it all in. He looked around his restaurant, the place he had built with his mother's values. Tonight had reminded him of something he had known all along. Respect and dignity were the heart of everything, and the lesson was far more important than any meal served. The story of that evening with the diners and staff, reminding them that small moments could reveal so much, and sometimes those moments could change everything.